In March 2023, something highly unusual happened in the global financial system. Within a span of just 3 days, the world's most influential central banks took a joint step that barely made headlines. The Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, Bank of England, Bank of Japan, Swiss National Bank, and Bank of Canada all released a coordinated announcement. They revealed the creation of permanent swap line facilities, ongoing agreements that allow them to exchange currencies with one another instantly, without limits whenever needed. Pause for a moment and think about what that really means. The most powerful financial institutions on Earth quietly set up an unlimited emergency liquidity network and labeled it as a precaution. Ask yourself this: when have central banks ever introduced a so-called precaution and then never used it? Practically never. Which suggests they are getting ready for something serious enough that required full coordination between all major central banks, something they seem to anticipate yet are unwilling to openly discuss. Clues to what they're preparing for are actually visible if you know where to look. Pay attention to what central banks have been doing away from public attention. Start with their aggressive buying behavior. In 2022 and 2023, central banks collectively acquired around 2,262 tons of gold. This marked the largest wave of gold purchases in more than 5 decades. That alone raises questions. What makes it even more puzzling is the timing. These purchases happened while officials were publicly insisting that inflation was temporary and that national currencies remained stable. If currencies were truly secure, why rush to accumulate gold? Look at the numbers. China's central bank disclosed an increase of about 225 tons in its gold reserves. Poland's central bank also made a significant move, adding roughly 130 tons to its holdings. Singapore, India, and Turkey have also been rapidly increasing their physical gold reserves, reaching historic levels. But the situation becomes even more revealing when you look further. Next comes the system no one publicly demanded. In July 2023, the Bank for International Settlements, often called the Central Bank of Central Banks, introduced a project known as the Phineas Fine. Yes, that is the actual name. According to their own explanation, it represents a blueprint for the future financial system. Hidden within the technical documentation is a critical line stating that it is designed to function during times of financial instability or when existing infrastructure is disrupted. In simple terms, this means they are constructing an alternative financial framework, and the obvious question is, why build a backup unless you expect the current system to break down? Then there are the drills. Since 2020, the Federal Reserve, together with the US Treasury and the FDIC, has been running what they refer to as resolution planning exercises every year. These are not casual tests, they are in-depth simulations of large-scale bank collapses, not isolated failures, but multiple institutions falling at the same time. The 2023 exercise outlined a scenario where several systemically important banks come under extreme pressure after a sudden collapse in market confidence. This is more than crisis preparation. This is practice. They are not just planning for a financial emergency, they are rehearsing one. If this pattern sounds familiar, it should. History has shown us this before. In 1927, central banks from the United States, Britain, France, and Germany held a confidential meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. No official records were released, and the media was kept out entirely. Years later, leaked documents revealed that these institutions had agreed on a coordinated move to cut interest rates at the same time, even though credit bubbles were already expanding in their economies. Their goal was to protect the British pound, which was under pressure after the United Kingdom returned to the gold standard. The outcome was disastrous. That synchronized easing fueled an even larger credit boom, which directly contributed to the 1929 market collapse and the onset of the Great Depression. What truly matters here is not just that the decision was wrong, it's that it was made collectively, behind closed doors, while the public was assured that everything was under control. Now fast forward to March 1968. For several months, central banks were holding confidential meetings in Basel, Switzerland, the headquarters of the BIS. The focus of those discussions was how to protect the gold standard. As large amounts of US dollars poured into Europe, they set up what became known as the gold pool. This was a coordinated intervention system in which central banks agreed to sell gold together in order to push prices down and preserve the illusion that 1 ounce of gold could still be bought for $35. For years, officials assured the public that the system was sound. Behind the scenes, however, gold reserves were being rapidly drained in an attempt to keep it alive. So what was the outcome? In August 1971, President Nixon shut the gold window anyway. The monetary system that had been secretly defended for years collapsed over a single weekend. Anyone who believed the central bank narrative saw their purchasing power disappear almost overnight. Now comes the most alarming example. In August 2007, central banks first rolled out temporary swap lines, the very same tool that was made permanent in 2023. Transcripts from Federal Reserve meetings during that time, released years later, reveal something deeply concerning. In private discussions, Fed officials were already talking about intense stress in the banking sector, liquidity problems, and the risk of contagion spreading through the system. But what message did the public hear? On June 20th, 2007, Ben Bernanke told Congress, "We do not expect significant spillovers from the subprime market to the rest of the economy." Just 4 months later, emergency lending programs were being created. 14 months after that, Lehman Brothers collapsed and the global financial system came dangerously close to failure. The pattern never changes: quiet coordination, construction of emergency mechanisms, public reassurances that everything is fine, followed by surprise when the crisis finally erupts. So, what are they getting ready for now? The signs point to 5 distinct scenarios, and preparations appear to be underway for all of them at the same time. Consider the US Treasury market, valued at around $26 trillion. It is supposed to be the most liquid and reliable market on the planet. Yet in March 2020, it failed. For 3 days, Treasury prices behaved erratically. What is normally the safest asset in the world became difficult to trade. The Federal Reserve had to step in, purchasing roughly $1 trillion to restore normal functioning. Then it happened again in October 2023. During a routine Treasury auction, liquidity suddenly vanished. Once again, the Fed quietly stepped in to stabilize the situation. Now look at the structures being put in place. The standing repo facility has been expanded beyond banks to include primary dealers and qualified money market funds with no stated limit on capacity. Round-the-clock availability. They are putting systems in place to ensure the Treasury market keeps operating the next time it breaks. Not if it breaks, but when. So why would the Treasury market fail again? Because roughly $7.5 trillion in Treasury debt must be refinanced within the next year. At the same time, overseas investors, who once purchased about 40% of new Treasury issuance, have turned into net sellers. China has cut its Treasury holdings by around $300 billion since 2020. Japan has been selling Treasuries to support the yen. Saudi Arabia is reducing its reliance on the dollar. With traditional buyers stepping back, the question becomes unavoidable. Who will absorb $7.5 trillion in new U.S. debt? Now consider U.S. commercial real estate. The sector is valued at roughly $20 trillion, and about $1.5 trillion in commercial real estate loans are set to mature between 2024 and 2026. The issue is timing. These loans were issued when office buildings were around 95% occupied and interest rates sat near 2 to 3%. Today, office occupancy has dropped closer to 50%, while rates are closer to 7 to 8%. A 2023 National Bureau of Economic Research study concluded that 385 U.S. banks could face insolvency if commercial property values fall by 20%. In many major cities, prices have already dropped by about 35%. So why haven't these banks collapsed yet? Because regulators are allowing them to avoid marking these loans to current market prices. Properties are still being valued on balance sheets at 2019 levels, even though it's widely understood they're worth far less today. Now look at the actions being taken by central banks. After the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, the Federal Reserve introduced the Bank Term Funding Program, which allows banks to borrow against securities at face value, regardless of what those assets are worth in the market. This creates a way for banks that are effectively insolvent to keep operating by borrowing against assets that have lost substantial value. It's a system-wide version of extend and pretend. At the same time, 107 countries, representing about 95% of global GDP, are either researching or testing central bank digital currencies. The Federal Reserve is experimenting with a wholesale digital payment system known as FedNow. The European Central Bank continues pushing forward with the digital euro despite strong public resistance. Officials say the goal is efficiency and financial inclusion, but focus on the features being developed: programmable money that can limit how funds are spent, expiration dates that cause money to vanish if unused, geographic controls that restrict where currency functions, and negative interest rates that penalize saving. Why build money with these capabilities? Because when the next crisis arrives, authorities will need direct control over currency in order to steer economic behavior. In 2008, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to near zero and implemented quantitative easing. Yet, people and businesses still refrained from spending, fear dominated, and most simply saved their money. Next time, they don't want to depend on hope. They plan to create money that must be spent in specific locations by specific deadlines. Essentially, they are constructing the tools for direct control over monetary flow. Global debt has now reached $237 trillion, which is about 336% of the world's GDP. The US federal debt alone stands at around $34 trillion, growing by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. Annual interest payments on US debt now exceed $1.1 trillion, more than the federal defense budget and more than Medicare spending. Here's the danger. At today's interest rates, servicing the debt consumes 18% of all federal tax revenue. If rates rise to 6%, that jumps to 30%. At 8%, debt payments alone take up 40% of all revenue, meaning the government would be borrowing just to pay interest on existing debt. This is mathematically a debt death spiral. What options do central banks have? Option 1, allow interest rates to rise naturally and let governments default. Option 2, print money to purchase government debt and watch the currency collapse. There is no easy third option. Look at what they're preparing: yield curve control. The Bank of Japan has been using it for years, and now the Fed is building the same infrastructure. Yield curve control allows central banks to set interest rates on government bonds while printing whatever money is needed to maintain those rates. This guarantees control over interest rates, but also ensures a loss of currency value. Essentially, they are preparing to prioritize currency devaluation over government default. The US dollar has served as the world's reserve currency since 1944, and approximately 59% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. Around 85% of all global foreign exchange transactions involve the US dollar, but changes are underway. In 2023, approximately 23% of China's cross-border transactions were settled in UAN, up from 0% in 2010. The BRICS nations are developing alternative payment networks, and Saudi Arabia is now accepting UAN for oil sales. Meanwhile, the Bank for International Settlements released a report in December 2023 titled The Future Monetary System. Hidden on page 47 is a revealing statement. Central banks should prepare for situations in which multiple reserve currencies operate at the same time. In other words, they are aware that dollar dominance is coming to an end. When that happens, the US can no longer simply print dollars and expect other nations to hold them. The existing $34 trillion debt would instantly become a crisis because the US cannot just export inflation globally anymore. All the infrastructure being built, the swap lines, digital currencies, and emergency lending programs is designed to retain control during the transition from a single, dominant currency to a multi-currency system. Why don't they openly explain what they are preparing for? Because publicly acknowledging these risks would trigger the very crises they are trying to prevent. For example, if the Fed said, "We are concerned about treasury market instability," investors would immediately start selling treasuries, causing instability. If they admitted commercial real estate loans are at risk, depositors could pull funds from regional banks, sparking bank runs. In March 2023, something highly unusual happened in the global financial system. Within just 3 days, the world's most influential central banks acted jointly in a move that barely made headlines. The Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, Bank of England, Bank of Japan, Swiss National Bank, and Bank of Canada released a coordinated announcement. They revealed the creation of permanent swap line facilities, agreements that allow them to exchange currencies instantly, without limits, whenever needed. The most powerful financial institutions quietly established an unlimited emergency liquidity system and labeled it as precautionary. Ask yourself this: when have central banks ever introduced something called a precaution and then never used it? Practically never. This suggests they are preparing for something serious enough to require full coordination between all major central banks. Clues to what they are preparing for are visible if you know where to look. Start with their gold purchases. In 2022 and 2023, central banks globally acquired around 2,262 tons of gold, the largest wave of purchases in more than 50 years. This happened while officials claimed inflation was temporary and currencies remained stable. If currencies were secure, why rush to accumulate gold? China added 225 tons, and Poland increased holdings by 130 tons. Singapore, India, and Turkey also bought physical gold at record levels. In July 2023, the Bank for International Settlements launched a project called the Phineas Fine. Their description outlined a vision for the future financial system. Buried in the technical documents was a critical phrase capable of operating during financial instability or infrastructure disruption. Simply put, they are constructing a backup financial system. Central banks have also been rehearsing crisis scenarios. Since 2020, the Federal Reserve, US Treasury, and FDIC have conducted detailed simulations of large-scale bank failures, including multiple institutions collapsing at the same time. In 2023, the scenario involved systemic stress following a sudden loss of market confidence. They are not merely planning for a crisis, they are practicing for one. History repeats itself. In 1927, central banks of the US, Britain, France, and Germany held a secret meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to coordinate interest rate cuts. No records were released and no press coverage was allowed. Their aim was to support the British pound after the UK returned to the gold standard. The coordinated easing fueled a credit boom that led directly to the 1929 crash and the Great Depression. The lesson? Secret coordination while reassuring the public rarely ends well. In August 2007, central banks first used temporary swap lines, the same tool made permanent in 2023. Private Federal Reserve transcripts revealed discussions of severe banking stress, liquidity concerns, and potential contagion, while public statements downplayed risks. 14 months later, Lehman Brothers collapsed, nearly ending the financial system. The pattern is always the same: coordinate secretly, build emergency infrastructure, reassure the public, then act shocked when the crisis hits. The US Treasury market, valued at $26 trillion, is supposed to be the most liquid in the world, yet in March 2020 and again in October 2023, Treasury liquidity broke down, forcing the Fed to intervene with trillions in purchases. Standing repo facilities were expanded to include primary dealers and money market funds with unlimited capacity. Treasury debt of $7.5 trillion must be rolled over in the next 12 months, but foreign buyers are retreating. China reduced Treasury holdings by $300 billion since 2020, Japan is selling to support the yen, and Saudi Arabia is diversifying away from dollars. US commercial real estate is valued at $20 trillion, with $1.5 trillion in loans maturing between 2024 and 2026. Many loans were issued when offices were 95% occupied and rates were 2 to 3%. Now occupancy is around 50% and rates are 7 to 8%. Banks are kept afloat by regulators, allowing them to avoid marking loans to market value. The Fed's Bank Term Funding Program allows banks to borrow against assets at face value, creating a system-wide extend and pretend. Meanwhile, 107 countries representing 95% of global GDP are exploring central bank digital currencies. These systems will have programmable money, expiration dates, geographic restrictions, and negative interest rates, allowing direct control over spending during the next crisis. In 2008, zero rates and quantitative easing failed to get people and businesses to spend. Next time, authorities want to program money, so it must be spent in specific places by specific dates. The global debt is $237 trillion, about 336% of GDP. US federal debt is $34 trillion, increasing $1 trillion every 100 days. Interest payments now consume 18% of all federal revenue, potentially rising to 30 to 40% if rates increase, creating a debt death spiral. Central banks are preparing yield curve control to maintain rates, which guarantees currency devaluation over government default. Dollar dominance is shifting. In 2023, 23% of China's cross-border transactions used yuan, up from 0% in 2010. BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems, and Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for oil. The BIS report, the future monetary system, states central banks must prepare for multiple reserve currencies operating simultaneously. This is why swap lines, digital currencies, and emergency lending programs are being built to retain control during the transition to a multi-currency world. They cannot publicly admit these risks without triggering them. If the Fed warns of treasury market instability, investors would sell treasuries, causing dysfunction. If they disclose impaired commercial loans, depositors would withdraw funds, creating bank runs. Every crisis follows the same pattern. Emergency infrastructure is quietly built, coordination occurs, the public is told everything is fine, and the crisis unfolds. Savers in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen lose. Pensioners and retirees lose purchasing power. Middle-class wages lag inflation. Small banks fail while major banks are bailed out. Hard assets, commodities, real estate, and monetary metals win. The ultra-wealthy, with assets and advice, navigate the situation successfully. You don't need to be ultra-wealthy to win. Understanding what is coming before the majority is enough. Central banks' actions, buying gold, building backup systems, rehearsing crises, and coordinating globally, reveal their intentions. The crisis is inevitable. The question is whether you will be on the winning side or the losing side. The time to prepare is now, while they are still claiming that everything is fine. Once they stop, it will already be too late.